By the mid-19th century, there was a distinct conflict in interests between the Dutch South Africans, who by now were calling themselves Boers or Afrikaners, and the British South Africans, who had a big mining interest there. The Dutch had just wanted to farm, but the British desperately wanted to exploit the mineral wealth and get rich. And tensions came to a head in the late 19th century when an event took place known as the Boer War. Most people think it was the Nazis who invented concentration camps, but it wasn't. It was the British under General Kitchener during the Boer War. Although they weren't designated death camps like the Nazi ones were, the conditions there were disgusting and insanitary, and the women and children that were held there died in their thousands from waterborne diseases. These concentration camps proved to be such an effective weapon against the Boers that they had to surrender in 1902, and the Boer general Paul Kruger signed the surrender document at Ladysmith, South Africa, and now South Africa remained under British control. South Africa remained under British control. That was until just after World War II, when the hated regime of apartheid was implemented. What the word apartheid translated to was apart, and what it meant in reality was racial segregation. The two peoples of South Africa were now split up into two groups, whites and non-whites. If you were white, you had all the freedoms that life had to offer, but if you were non-white, you were forced to work for a pittance for the white man, live in squalid shanty towns, and most of all carry the hated passbook. The passbook was an attempt by the Afrikaans government to control the movements of the non-whites. In it you would have your photograph and all your personal details like your sex, height, weight and eye colour, and things like weapons and driving licences, as well as residency, and indeed failure to produce one when stopped by the police could result in imprisonment or a fine. Quite understandably, the non-whites didn't like being treated like this and rose up wherever they could. Initially, the rest of the world tolerated the apartheid regime. That was until an event that happened in 1960 known as the Sharpeville massacre. Sharpeville was a township just outside the Transvaal area of South Africa, and on the day in question, a big demonstration outside the town's police station was planned. The police officer in charge on that day, Lieutenant Colonel Pienaar, and his deputy Major Van Zyl were on nervous tenterhooks. The reason that the two men were on nervous tenterhooks was because of an event that had happened in the South African city of Durban a couple of months earlier, when some police officers had been gunned down trying to close an illegal beer hall. The police officers inside the compound were heavily armed with mounted machine guns and long-distance rifles, and when the crowd started pressing against the perimeter fence, Lieutenant Colonel Pienaar panicked and gave his men the order to fire on the crowd. They opened up on the crowd with everything they had, killing 59 people, many of whom were women and children shot in the back as they were running away. When they'd run out of bullets, they came out of the police station to inspect their handiwork, did little to nothing to help the wounded or the dying, and simply went home for tea. Unfortunately for Lieutenant Colonel Pienaar, a British journalist was present in the crowd and ran off to report the story to the South African newspapers. However, the administration of the time under Hendrik Verwoerd had a very tight grip on the state media, and the newspapers wouldn't dare report it. Unluckily for Verwoerd, the British journalist managed to get out of South Africa and get back to Fleet Street in London, where he broke the story. Now the whole world was able to learn about the goings-on at Sharpeville. When Verwoerd himself was approached for an explanation, he publicly refused to condemn the massacre or let any of the men responsible face trial. After this event, South Africa was no longer seen as a civilized nation, and the rest of the world took out trade embargoes and sanctions.